All right, so welcome. Today I am joined by Brach Jennings, who is currently working on his dissertation in Tübingen under the supervision of Professor Jürgen Moltmann, as well as Volker Leppin, who is a church historian, and the Womanist theologian and anthropologist Linda Thomas. I'm very happy to have him here to discuss more about his work, but perhaps a little bit selfishly, I'm just interested in get a bit of insight into Professor Moltmann and what it's like working with him, because I'm quite jealous of that. So thanks for joining me, Brach.
I'm very, very happy to be doing this with you. Thanks for having me on. Sorry, I laughed there. You said you were jealous of my working with Moltmann. So we're off to a good start here. We're already laughing, and you haven't even asked me a question yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you could just start us off by introducing yourself and perhaps saying a little bit about your academic history and maybe what led you up to your dissertation.
Sure. Well, to make not a short story long, but a long story short, I had been studying theology at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago for a PhD in systematic theology under the now late theologian Vitor Westella. He had stage 4 cancer and he died tragically in 2018. I had already in that first year been studying with Linda Thomas and was very fascinated by the Womanist theological approach. And she and I formed a very good rapport with one another. And I then, under her influence, went to Jürgen Moltmann to ask him to take me as his student. But there was one other piece in here, which was before I began in Chicago, I wrote a master's thesis at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I passed that thesis with honors and was encouraged by my thesis committee to send it to Professor Moltmann because one of my chapters was on Moltmann. And so I sent my thesis to him in 2017, and I heard that was in June. And in December, I heard back from him apologizing to me that he hadn't responded yet, but he had lost my address. And there was a whole sort of winding circumstance of how I came into contact with him. He sent the response to my thesis advisor, Guillermo Hansen in Minnesota, but I was already in Chicago and had begun my doctorate. But I connected with Guillermo again over my birthday, actually. I went up to St. Paul to see him and my other teacher, Lois Malcolm, and some friends from Minnesota. And I just wanted to go up there again. So I had dinner with Guillermo, and he gave me Moltmann's letter, and I was so moved by what Moltmann had said about my master's thesis. And then I said to Guillermo, I think I should visit him. And Guillermo agreed. And so it was just that I was just going to fly to Tübingen at some point and visit him and, ask him about a Luther or something. Because in those days, my main interest really was the theology of Martin Luther. It is not anymore. My interests have shifted. I still love Luther, and I don't know. I don't know if you've seen the movie Hannibal, but Clarice Starling has got a great line in there about Hannibal Lecter, and she says the following: "He's always with me, kind of like a bad habit." That's what Martin Luther is for me. But anyway. So it was just going to be a visit to fly to Tübingen and ask Moltmann about the theology of the cross or something like that. That was the parallel narrative to my beginning my doctorate and Vitor Westella being terribly sick. It was really tragic when he died. I tell you, that's one of the hardest things I lived through, my doctoral advisor dying. I don't want to make light of that. It was utterly devastating. Mm-hmm. And then it was Linda Thomas who said to me, you need to go to Moltmann and ask him to take you as his student. And I went, seriously, he's 92. But, Vitor had died. I had asked Dr. Thomas to be my advisor, and she very gladly agreed. And, so all of that was set, but it was she who wanted me to come here to Germany. And so I have a great debt to her. And I went to Moltmann, and I couldn't quite ask him to be my advisor in Tübingen. I was a little too scared, but I asked him to be on my committee, and he said yes. Shockingly, at 92. So I flew home back to Chicago, and then Dr. Thomas invited him to officially be the co-supervisor at Chicago, at the Lutheran Seminary in Chicago. He said yes again. And in the meantime, she was consistent all the time. She said, if you can do this, I want you at Tübingen. I want you finishing with him as lead supervisor. All the time she said that, but she was very delighted to be co-supervisor with him in Chicago. And so we worked it out that I would spend a semester in Tübingen with Dr. Moltmann. And to me, I'd been reading Moltmann since I was an MDiv student at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley. And are you catching a theme here? One Lutheran seminary, another Lutheran seminary, another. I was a Lutheran. I'd been reading him since, second year of my MDiv. So his theology had really shaped me deeply. Still does, by the way. But to that time, it was something different. And so spending a semester with him was like, this dream come true. Like, oh my God, I'm gonna study with Jürgen Moltmann for a semester. And so I came over in April 2019. I think it was April 7th. So it was the day before his birthday, because his birthday is the 8th of April. And then I saw him for the first time on the 10th. He gave me homework. He gave me homework right after my first meeting. It was great. It was a book it was a Korean feminist take on the cross, and he wanted me to analyze that. And that was my first assignment. And then 2 weeks later, he handed me, and by the way, still haven't switched to Tübingen. I'm still a seminary student doing a doctorate in Chicago. I am not a doctoral student at the University of Tübingen. Then he handed me his copy from 1952, I think it is, of 2.2 of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics in German. And he said, read 100 pages by next week. Now, he didn't give me the book because we had it I was living at the Evangelische Stift in Tübingen, which is a very tradition-rich a place for theology students to live. And they have an exchange program with the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. So I was their exchange student for a semester. By the way, one semester turned into 2.5 years, but that's a different story. He said, read 100 pages by next week. Well, I could barely read a page of German. I mean, let's be real. I looked at him like he was from Mars. And my eyes must have gotten huge, and I was terrified. He said, okay, 3 weeks. I went, oh, thank God. And so I literally began to teach myself German this is maybe a slightly secular story, by reading Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics and by watching Sex Education with Gillian Anderson in German. Those were the two ways that I began to teach myself German. No, very different German mediums. And I stayed here for those 3 weeks, and it must have been 3 or 4 weeks when I asked Moltmann to be my supervisor here. And I told him Linda Thomas had wanted this from day one. I was just not brave enough to ask the question. It didn't take me long to realize that I really felt the Holy Spirit was moving me out of the seminary and into the university, although I've never really left the seminary behind, but that I needed to finish here. And well, he said he wanted to see my dissertation proposal. And so I decided, and I fell in love with Karl Barth, by the way, from page 1 of 2.2. I had never read theology that spoke to me that deeply. I mean, even my beloved Luther didn't touch me the same place Tutu did.
Was that your first Bart text that you had read, Tutu?
No. Yes, wait, I don't want to lie. I read excerpts, and I do mean excerpts, of the second Römerbrief Kommentar from 1922, in December of my first year of seminary. So I remember nothing of it. And then I spent the next, 8 years avoiding Bart. And Moltmann wasn't going to let me get away with that because, for so many reasons. I'm sorry, I lost it. He wanted the dissertation proposal. And so I said I wanted to do a Theologia Crucis from Martin Luther to James Cohen. Now the James Cohen, I like to tell people I was reading Cohen before it was cool. Because now there are a lot, and I think you were too, by the way, Stephen, if I've gotten this correct, but now, it's all these classes and people are putting him in their papers and all this. I was actually doing that before. It was a thing. I read him for the first time in 2014. Wait, no, that's not quite right. 2015, I was a vicar in Oregon and I read him. And I fell in love with him instantly, and I noted a similarity between him and Moltmann. And intuitively, I picked up on a Theologia Crucis in him. And I think that's because, I was trained as a Lutheran. So that's just my default. Like, I can find that pretty easily based on my training. But anyway, back to the dissertation, I thought since the first time I read Cohen, it would be so cool to put Luther and Cohen in dialogue. And I don't mean cool like, well, I'm doing it because it's fun. I mean, this would revolutionize a Theologia Crucis if we do this. And I spoke with James Cohen in 2016. I spoke with him just one time for an hour because originally I wanted to go to Union for a doctorate, but looking back, I didn't get in, by the way, but looking back, I think it was because if I had gone to Union, I needed Cohen as my advisor. I needed somebody competent in what you and I would call dialectical theology. And that's just, that wasn't there were still people there. There was a Tillich scholar there who was very interested in me, and I wanted to write on Tillich at that time. So I've done some theological shifting from then to now. But I did speak with Cohen, and he told me that he read a lot of Luther in graduate school and that Lutherans domesticate Luther. And that he would be willing, if I got into Union, to do an independent study with me on Luther in relation to his Black theology. So that would have been so great. But it didn't pan out. And I didn't speak to him again after that one conversation, but he told me something that really was, looking back, a formative moment. He said, if you want to be a systematic theologian like myself and others, you better be reading Barth and Tillich and Bultmann. And what do you say to that? But yes, sir. My first published article was on Tillich. My second published article was on Bultmann, and my entire dissertation is indebted to Karl Barth. So and that's obviously the shift. That's the elephant in the room that I haven't talked about. My shift was I really did accept Barth. Barth went from nothing in my theological life to my favorite theologian in the last 3 years. And that's really, that's all Moltmann.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I meant, so I decided, I wrote him the dissertation proposal. I'm sorry, it's such a long story. I'm trying to make it short, but it's so like, I don't know how else to tell this. So I wrote him the dissertation proposal, 2 pages. I read it out loud in his study to him, actually. It felt very, I don't know, like 1930s or 20s almost, doing it that way. And he said, okay, I agree. And I lost all my composure at that moment. And then I needed a secondary supervisor. In Germany, you have two. You have the first reader and the second reader. And because again, to that time, my real interest was still Luther. I hadn't shifted from Luther to Barth. So I asked Volker Leppin to be my secondary supervisor. I have a track record of finding Luther scholars, tracking them down and asking them to somehow work with me. And for some reason, they all say yes. Sorry for them. They get stuck with me. And Volker Leppin very graciously agreed. And although he does not share my interest in Barth, he was definitely the right choice to get through the dissertation and changing into Germany and, for all things related to the university now, because Moltmann is emeritus, obviously. So I'm very glad that has worked out the way it has. He's no longer here. He is now professor of historical theology at Yale. But that's not a problem. He's still the secondary supervisor of my dissertation. And then I said from day one, I asked the Tübingen faculty this, and they agreed to it gladly, that Linda Thomas would be a special outside reader of my dissertation. And that was very important to me because she studied with Cohen at Union, and she had become so very important to me. From my time in Chicago, she sent me to Germany. I mean, I don't think that's an overstatement, and remains a crucial part of my approach to theology and life to this moment. So I like to tell people I have a trinity of supervisors, and Moltmann is the glue that holds this thing together, but I've got a trinity of supervisors. I think you have a question about that.
Yeah. No, it is a very interesting combination of supervisors. I wonder Moltmann's probably good to be characterized as maybe a systematic theologian, Leppin being the church historian, and Thomas is the womanist theologian and anthropologist. Is that lead to any conflicts between them? Is there any, I mean, the diversity of opinions, I'm sure is quite broad. But maybe we could speak on that dynamic a bit.
Oh, I'll never tell publicly. No, it is. It's an odd mix, but I've lived my whole life like that, and I like a good challenge. I like to take things that aren't thought normally to put together and put them together. And really, the odd mix on this is asking a church historian to be part of my work, and then dialectically saying I'm not a historian. Yes, I know, ironic, but I like to do that, and I don't know why. I don't know if that's a character flaw or a character strength, but I've always been like that ever since probably my undergraduate. It was always people were saying, well, it's not common to do X or Y. And I'm like, well, then I want to try it. And, obviously I've failed a few times, but it's worked out okay. And yeah, the diversity of opinions is interesting. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm a systematic theologian, right? I'm not a historian. I'm not an anthropologist. I like anthropology. I have a degree in history, actually, but that was one of my undergraduates. It wasn't something I went on past undergrad. But I'm not a historian. I'm a trained systematician. I have 2 degrees specifically in systematics and then my MDiv. I guess the reason why this works for me and why it works well is even though my dissertation is a piece of constructive theology, having the voices of Leppin and Dr. Thomas broadens me out somehow. It prevents me from getting too stuck in left to my own devices. I would sit and read the church dogmatics all day long and do nothing else. and this prevents me from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it works so well for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's why all the way back to my undergraduate, I was always trying to not get myself stuck. I was a music major to begin with, and I thought I wanted to be a music historian, actually. And of course, the chairman of the department told me I couldn't do it. I wanted to be a music historian, so I wanted to add a history minor to my music major. And of course, the chairman of the department told me I couldn't do it. All my other faculty said yes, but he said no. And that was the impetus to go do more than what he said I couldn't do, which was to add a history major. And then I took so many classes that I actually got 2 BAs out of the deal. So it worked well. But even back in those days, I found myself jumbling a lot of different approaches. And, so I think I fell in love with that sort of odd combination. Well, I don't know that music and history is terribly odd, but with a combination that wouldn't necessarily be expected, I think I've been doing since I was in undergrad. And by the time I got to theology, by the time I got to my master's thesis, I said, hey, I'm going to stick Luther, Tillich, and Moltmann together and see what happens. And that's what I did. And, are you seeing a pattern here?
For sure. No, that's great. It sounds like a really interesting combo and all of that. Because your dissertation, it seems like it ties together a lot of these kind of threads that aren't typically brought together. You mentioned Luther, Barth, Bonhoeffer, and then Cohen and Moltmann, of course.
Don't forget Moltmann. Gosh,
Moltmann,
I wrote 36 pages on that chapter. Don't forget Moltmann.
Yeah, for sure. So Moltmann does turn 96 this year, which is quite remarkable how active he still is. Is there anything that you can speak to working with him on a regular basis? What's that like for those of us who are gleaming with jealousy over getting to spend so much time with Professor Moltmann? Just wonder if you give some sneak behind the curtain and let us know what that's like.
I will miss it when I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
I will miss that very much. I'm sure I will remain in contact with him, but I love going to see him, and what he has to say about my work, and we laugh a lot. There's a lot of laughing with Dr. Moltmann. That probably doesn't surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
He is trying very hard to release me. I don't know how successful he is in my heart of hearts, but he's really trying to release me from categories and labels. So I don't call myself a Lutheran anymore. Well, I haven't been one officially for a while, but unofficially, he wants to release me from these labels. So in other words, I will not refer to myself as a Barthian, for instance. If I have to pick a label, because we humans have to categorize ourselves, I would say that somehow, like you, frankly, I labor in the waters of dialectical theology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine for me, because that's a pretty broad brush. And me, I'm gonna sit and say, well, people don't think Barth and Moltmann talk to each other. Watch me. People don't think Barth and Tillich can communicate. Watch me. And that's sort of my the thing that I like to stir up. But even the notion of being a dialectical theologian, I would even hesitate to say that about myself. I'm a Christian theologian. That's good enough for me. That's where I'm trying to get. And Moltmann has really shown me that.
That seems to be a bit of Moltmann's approach as well. He doesn't seem to have this desire to pin himself down to a particular label, or as he talks about in his experiences in theology, the road emerged as he walked it. He didn't feel like he had to put himself in a box. Do you think that's true with him as well?
Oh, sure. I think that's true with him. And I think the only sort of not pinning down, but you want to establish the boundary of your method and your hermeneutics And then once you've done that, there is the freedom to draw from these sources that I'm talking about, and particularly ones that aren't thought to play well together. I suppose I do get that from Moltmann, honestly, because he's doing that.
Sure.
So I'm sure I get that from him.
Nice. So you have, in my understanding, you have weekly meetings with him. Do you, and he gives you assignments? How exactly is the dynamic with on the day-to-day basis, I guess, with him?
Well, I don't meet with him weekly anymore. I used to. My first semester, I met weekly with him, and then he turned me loose, and we met once a month. And then I met with Leppin. Well, I'm always in contact with Leppin, so that's something different. But or quite frequently, I mean, in contact with him. But then I started meeting Moltmann once a month from, I think, September 2019 until today. And sometimes, like, he asked me to translate something for him, and so just yesterday, actually. So I'll do that, and so I might. There are certain occasions where I might see him more than once a month. That's not a hard and fast rule. Or sometimes, one time he found a very interesting article from Cohen, and he emailed me and said, come see me at 3 tomorrow. I found something interesting for you. But we usually meet half an hour, 40 minutes, sometimes an hour. And then, I'm a German doctoral student now. And so it's about me and the books and writing. And, it's very, very much the European model. But yeah, in the beginning, it was every week. And he told me, exegete Karl Barth like it is the Bible. And that's what I tried to do. I gave him 15 pages of Barth quotes in English and German. And that was how we started.
Very cool.
And it just kind of evolved and worked. And, I was at his symposium in October for his 95th birthday in Bad Boll. That was wonderful. His early doctoral students, former doctoral students, all spoke about what his theology means to them, and how that it affected them, and how they developed his theology in their own ways, and so forth. So that was delightful. And then he actually said at that symposium that I was his last. No more students after me. And it's not because I drive him crazy, just to be clear.
Yeah.
So that's, who would have thought? I never would have seen it turn out this way. Never would have thought it could have turned out this way.
No, that's remarkable. And I'm sure quite the honor to have the opportunity. So I do want to ask a bit more about your dissertation in particular. Of course, I'm gleaming with jealousy about Moltmann, but I do think your dissertation on its own is very interesting. I've read parts of it. I read your Barth chapter just recently, and you've showed me some of your other work on it. Can you speak a little bit more about what your thesis particularly is, what you're trying to prove with your dissertation, what you're trying to argue, a little bit more, if you can? In as succinct as possible.
Yeah, of course. You asked a doctoral student to be succinct about their dissertation. Doctoral students are never succinct about their dissertations, but I'll try to be.
Someone that appreciates Barth as well.
Well, right.
Also was not very succinct.
Well, my approach to systematic theology is the following: why say one word when you could say 1,000 instead?
Why write one volume in church dogmatics when you could write 14 and not even finish it after that?
Well, exactly. As Moltmann says, the praise of God has no beginning and no end.
Yeah.
Well, my question, rather, that I'm working with is, how is the Theologia Crucis in the early Martin Luther developed and changed by James Cone's Black theology of liberation? So what I'm trying to do is to argue constructively that Cone's theology is a needed shift and radicalization of the Theologia Crucis, which goes all the way back to Luther. And it's not just Luther, right? The Theologia Crucis is an ecumenical thing, but that specific word and that Latin phrase That is Luther, although he speaks more of the theologus crucis, the theologian of the cross, rather than the theology. But that's neither here nor there. So basically, I wanted to argue for the ongoing relevance of the Theologia Crucis through James Cohen. That is my raison d'etre at the moment, if I might speak bad French. And I found this preoccupation, if I might say, with Barth on the way. And it was always clear that I would have a chapter about Barth, and that Barth would be how I bridge Luther to the 20th century, or, well, Barth is a 20th century theologian, so perhaps not bridge, but how I would link Luther to the 20th century would be through Barth's doctrine of election, because when I read 2.2, I said, well, that's Barth's theology of the cross. Like, that's jumping out on me on every page. He's, and I'm not saying that Barth is a Lutheran. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that is a way to understand 2.2, and then that gets that's also then developed and radicalized by Moltmann. And then Bonhoeffer, although it's not known if Bonhoeffer was able to read 2.2, Bonhoeffer is very, very important because of the connection between a Theologia Crucis and political action. And Bonhoeffer shares all these commonalities with Barth, with what we might call the pre-2.2 Barth. Bonhoeffer has a lot of commonalities with, and particularly in light of the Barmen Declaration. And so gathering all that material, it's like getting a big engine going, right? This is a sweeping argument from Luther and then to Cohen. I mean, I studied music. I can't help but think in musical lines. It's just corrupted me forever. I
really liked your article, your chapter on Barth. I just recently read that. I was struck by how well you were able to connect the Theologia Crucis with Barth's doctrine of election. I think it's such a brilliant innovation that he had done with that volume. Certainly one of the best volumes, I think, of Church Dogmatics, one of the most essential. So yeah, I found that really interesting. I don't know if you could speak a little bit more about, necessarily in your article or in your chapter, you talk a little bit about the happy exchange that Luther brings up and how that correlates with Barth, particularly with the yes and no of God. I wonder if you can explain a little bit about that.
Well, that's my reading of it. I can't prove historically that Barth was sitting in his study and saying, I'm going to link the happy exchange here. But I think because he uses the word tausch, which is implicitly mystical, used in this theological context, and with the way that he speaks of God electing our suffering and the switch, right? Judas the betrayer, he elects as the apostle. He elects the cross and tomb as his kingly throne, right? And then he has this very tantalizing line that the crucified Jesus is the image of the invisible God, right? It's the crucified Jesus that's the image of the invisible God. That was key for me. And so whereas for Luther, the happy exchange was the mystical exchange between the soul of the believer and Christ, for Barth, it's a how would you say? It's an expansion to Christ and humankind. So that's why I say it's implicitly mystical, because you don't have the sort of individualism of mysticism there. You have a collective understanding. But Barth is using this language just dripping with doxology and mystical overtones. And Barth is so Johannine. I mean, John is the mystical gospel in the New Testament, right? So it was for those reasons that I began to argue for 2.2 as having the Theologia Crucis, and then particularly having the happy exchange. And that becomes crucial for me because I take that argument from Tutu, read the happy exchange in Bonhoeffer through Bonhoeffer's notion of Stellvertretung, vicarious representative action, and then see it again in Moltmann, where now Christ takes the pain of the victims onto himself. And with Moltmann, by the way, it's a conscious radicalization of the happy exchange. There is simply no doubt Moltmann is radicalizing Luther's freedom of the Christian. You can read an article about this that he published in German in 2018. But to get to Moltmann, first I worked through this in Barth and then Bonhoeffer and then Moltmann. And then by the time we get to Cohen, Cohen is going to have the same argument, a collective happy exchange with Christ taking the pain of the suffering Black victims into himself.
Yeah.
So
no,
there, I didn't take too long.
No, that was good. And I do appreciate, I love the fact that Cohen is kind of the culmination of what you're arguing. And he's obviously quite close to my heart. My latest book on in the Plain English series on James Cohen was one of the ones that I think was personally stretching for me to study Cohen. And Cohen's been somebody that has made a big personal impact on me, not only just theologically, but as an individual. And so I was quite happy with that. And it actually was through Cohen that you and I had met, which is kind of an interesting story. I sent a few books to Moltmann. I've corresponded with him a few times over mail. And I sent him my book that I just finished on Samuel Beckett, which was the first thing I actually ever wrote to Moltmann about. I sent him a letter asking if he had ever read Beckett. And to my surprise, he said he had, and that he was very interested in this possibility of studying Moltmann and Beckett, his thought in Beckett. And that was in 2017 that I wrote him. And then obviously I kind of changed course and wrote some of the Plain English series stuff. And then finally came back just this past year to the Beckett book and published it. And so I sent him that, and I also sent him several other books that I had written along the way. I sent him the Cohen book. And it was such an honor that he seemed to gravitate towards the Cohen book right away. He read it first and he responded to that book very quickly. But then out of the blue, out of nowhere, I get this Facebook message from you saying, "Oh, Professor Moltmann gave me your book as it relates to my dissertation and all this stuff." And it was such an honor for me to know that not only had Moltmann read it, responded to it, but he appreciated that book enough to give it to you. And so I think we have that in common with the appreciation of not only Barth, Moltmann, and all of the others, but leading to Cohen being, I think, I argue in my book that I think Cohen is very much a student of Barth par excellence. He takes what Barth does and radicalizes it so well, and I think he's best situated within that kind of Barthian tradition. Is that something that maybe you would agree with as well? Do you think the relation, obviously, with you're arguing to some extent that with your dissertation, but do you think in general Cohen fits within that theology of the Barthian tradition, as it's sometimes called?
Well, I don't know that I'm comfortable with speaking about Barthians, right? What is a Barthian? Karl Barth said once, if there are Barthians, I'm not one of them, right? I mean, even Eberhard Jungel did a wonderful interview in Switzerland in 2008. And the interviewer asked him, "Are you a Barthian?" And he flat out said no, right? And this is Eberhard Jungel. So if Jungel's not a Barthian, who is?
Definitely.
And sometimes I wonder that about Dr. Moltmann too. But so would I say that Cohen is part of the Barthian tradition? No, I wouldn't. I would say that Cohen, and I wouldn't even go so far as to say that he is a student of Barth par excellence, because Cohen is very clear. I am free to use Barth or leave him behind. I take this from Barth, I critique this in Barth. I take this from Bultmann, I critique this in Bultmann. I take this from Tillich, I critique him here. Reinhold Niebuhr, for instance, Cohen loved Reinhold Niebuhr, but he could rake Niebuhr through the coals as he does in Cross and the Lynching Tree. So I wouldn't use that label, although sometimes I'd like to, but I would be hesitant to use the label of Barthian for Cohen.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, and I think you're absolutely right about this, by the way. And I was just, anybody who's watching this, every one of you needs to read Stephen's book on Cohen because it's truly fabulous. But I would agree with you that Cohen's theology is a radicalization of things you would find in the church dogmatics. So at that point, yes. But I wouldn't say he is a Barthian. And he himself would not have wanted that label, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
because then we're constricted to these categories again, right? And if we say Cohen's a Barthian, then we're somehow saying that Karl Barth is more important for him than the dialectical relationship of King and Malcolm X. And if we say that, and I can see Martin and Malcolm in America on your bookshelf behind you, actually. So if we say that, we negate what may have been for him his most important book. And I actually won't spend a lot of time on Martin and Malcolm in America because it's not a dogmatic book. It's not a dogmatic constructive book. But I know for him, you know, how driven he was to read and listen and watch everything he could find on Martin and Malcolm. And when I spoke to him on the phone and I asked him about Karl Barth, he said that the influence on Barth on his thinking had lessened, that his intellectual trinity was Martin and Malcolm and Jimmy, as he put it, James Baldwin. And that he was Christocentric, and that was important to him, and that you know, you can't do good theology without fighting for it, he said to me. It sounds just like him, doesn't it? But it was, he said, you know, the influence of Barth is less now. Now, whether that's true in hindsight, right? That's how he understood it, whether the texts correspond to that. I think in some ways you could say Cohen is indebted to Barth dogmatically, constructively, for his Christological focus. Cohen says this in Black Theology and Black Power. Karl Barth brings theology back to its true Christian center, or true Christian character, excuse me. But I wouldn't say Barthian, if that makes sense. And I don't think you do in your book either, at least as I haven't read your book in a while, but you know, you sent me a copy, so I should probably read it again. But from what I remember, you don't actually call Cohen a Barthian.
No, right. I don't call him explicitly a Barthian. I think I definitely agree. I think the term Barthian itself is problematic. I think I meant more in the sense of, I guess, what we would maybe call post-Barthian, or because I think the best way to be a Barthian is to go beyond Barth, right? I think that would be an argument that could be made from Barth himself, that he never wanted to create heirs or students that are just indebted like a Calvinist or Lutheran or whatever, that have that very narrow approach, which is exactly what you're getting at as well. I think we're on the same page there.
Well, I love this notion of post-Barthian. I still, yes, when we're thinking of, we're thinking of Cohen as a dogmatician. The phrase post-Barthian works. But when we think about Cohen as his faith, we've got to talk about Macedonia AME Church. And we have to talk about his own experience as a Black person. We have to talk about the folk tales and the spirituals and the blues. When we discuss the slave songs and the spirituals, then what we're doing is we're talking about someone who is moving beyond the constraint of the white academy, right? That's the other reason that I would be hesitant to call Cohen a Barthian, is because it would say that he would be defined by what white academia says of him, right? And Barth is a very well respected theologian in the white Western Theological Academy, whereas these other sources move beyond him. So that's what I would say regarding, is he the student of Barth par excellence? He was a student of Barth's writings when he wrote his dissertation on Karl Barth's anthropology. Sure. Theological anthropology, I guess we could say. But I wouldn't say that he's using that in Black Theology and Black Power and Black Theology of Liberation and some early essays. But I don't think that he is still that student of Barth by the time he gets to God of the Oppressed, right? He's borrowing from Barth, he's borrowing from Bonhoeffer, he's borrowing from Moltmann, frankly. Cohen borrows a lot from Moltmann. But I wouldn't say that he is a student of them, shaped by.
Yeah, perhaps that's the best way to put it.
Shaped by. And free to take what he wanted and leave the rest, as he was trying to develop his own Black theology. And he's very clear he's got an essay in his book, Speaking the Truth, on his hermeneutics of Scripture and how he understands Scripture. He's actually far clearer on this than Barth is, in a sense. And then that's where he says what he takes from Moltmann, what he takes from Tillich, what he takes from Barth. I don't think he says Reinhold Niebuhr there, actually. I think we got to wait till later for that. But for me, what was most interesting is in Crossing the Lynching Tree, he doesn't borrow from Barth at all. He does Niebuhr there. And how does Niebuhr fit in with Karl Barth? So those would just be my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Definitely appreciate the insight there. Is there a particular relation with Cohen and the Theologia Crucis that you thought was worth writing about? Is there a particular reason why you chose him with that focus?
I chose Cohen because Moltmann had originally recommended that I go to Cohen. When I first met Moltmann in 2018, he said, go to Jim Cohen and the Lynch Tree Theology was his exact thing. And I thought I would still keep Tillich and all of this, but Moltmann suggested James Cohen instead, and so I did. And then he said, there's a strong theology of the cross in the Black church. And that tied in so well with the work that I was already doing with Linda Thomas. And it all just sort of came together as pieces of a puzzle. And even when I say Theologia Crucis and Cohen's Black Theology of Liberation, I'm not trying to imply Cohen is a Lutheran. Not at all. I'm just saying, where can we find in his theology, number one, hints of a Theologia Crucis, because there are places where he almost sounds like Luther, almost. And so that is something, where can the Theologia Crucis be found in these texts? But number two, and what for me is even the more important question, is how is the Theologia Crucis getting radicalized by Cohen, right? How is it developing from what we see in the early Luther, which is not a political theology, right? I mean, I always say, when it really mattered for Luther, Luther failed at his own theology, right? And I'm thinking, of course, of the slightly low-hanging fruit of the Peasants' Revolt of 1525, but I'm also thinking, Luther was completely incompetent regarding questions of Islam, right? He reads a translation of the Quran. He's got no sense that of what, at least from a 21st century perspective, of what Islam actually is. He's waiting for the world to end it's about an apocalyptic struggle between God and Satan. And, he's looking for, and he believed the world would end in his lifetime. Well, in a sense it did, because he died. So where it really mattered, I don't find a strong political theology in Luther. Now, my teacher, Vitor Vestela, would, and I'm in a different place now than I once was. I think we can read Luther in political ways, and we can read those texts, kind of like Calvin's Institutes was used in the struggle against apartheid, by the way, if you didn't know. I didn't know that either until very recently. Don't remember where I found that, but I found that very interesting. So kind of like, you can use historical sources, if you will, for liberative moments. I mean, even Bonhoeffer, when Bonhoeffer retrieves the Lutheran Formula of Concord from 1577, and he retrieves the two things, Articles 7 and 8 on Christology, and then the article, I'm forgetting which one it is, on adiaphora. He's doing that specifically, as well as the clause in the Augsburg Confession that cites Acts 5, we must obey God rather than human beings when commanded to sin. Bonhoeffer is doing that for an explicit purpose. But I don't think, so Bonhoeffer is finding the tools within Luther, and then in this case, Melanchthon, and then the other, the early Concordists, Jakob Andre, Martin Chemnitz, and other friends, many of whom associated with the University of Tübingen, by the way. But I don't think in and of itself, Luther was a political theologian like Moltmann or like Cohen. I don't believe that. And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask it. From hearing you talk about it, would you say that maybe one of the undertones of your thesis has something to do with politicizing the Theologia Crucis, or do you think it is inherently a political doctrine that, or do you have to then add it into it? Do you think it has that political connotation?
That's a really good question. I think, yes, the Theologia Crucis does become politicized, particularly in the authors that I chose. I think it needs to become politicized. I don't think, as Luther articulated it, it is a political theology. I think you have to take those famous theses 19 and 20. Theologian of Glory calls evil good and good evil. The Theologian of the Cross calls the thing as it is. That being the particular one that people like to cite, as well as God known in suffering. You have to take that and then radicalize it now. So it's like Luther gives you the grammar, and you've got to do something with it now. So the God recognized in suffering is certainly a political statement from the perspective of the 20th and 21st centuries. And in light of the liberation theologies that have developed in the church since the 1960s. But I don't think for Luther himself, it is this political statement. It was taken that way, particularly by Münzer. And well, what did it get him? It actually got him decapitated, to tell you the truth. And it was somehow, I don't know if it's the Theologia Crucis, but some of Luther's economic musings were picked up by Marx in volume 1 of Das Kapital, and Marx calls Luther the first German economist. Well, that's very interesting. And I even did my MTH thesis working on Theologia Crucis as the critique of consumerism and capitalism. But I mean, again, and I thought at that time that I could politicize Luther more than I would now. Now I would say we as contemporary theologians understand the political import of a theologia crucis, but Luther himself, I mean, even his establishing the common chest in Wittenberg, I mean, yeah, that's great, but that's basic Christian charity. He's not a liberation theologian. So,
Certainly, yeah.
You know who I draw a parallel to, believe it or not, with Luther,
Mm-hmm.
is Reinhold Niebuhr.
Interesting.
I could see a lot of parallels between Luther and Niebuhr.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why I have a lot of reservations with Luther. And I love him. But I have a lot of reservations, if that makes any sense. If you can hold that together, congratulations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can see that. I've been reading more about the Peasants' War myself, and about Munster and the relation with Luther. It does seem that on the one hand, his theology has some import where you can take it into the political realm, but then his actual actions in history were a little bit more on the reactionary side of kind of being, particularly with the incident with the Peasant War and all of that. But that's just a thought. I did want to comment as well that it seems like to some extent the progression of your dissertation moves from Luther, the basis in that, and then slowly is kind of turning up that dial to a more radical version of the Theologia Crucis, to the culmination in Cohen, which I think is a good place to land.
That's exactly what it's doing. It's exactly what it's doing. And I would say well, I say in my introduction, it's a constructive exploration in arguing for the ongoing relevance of the Theologia Crucis, were originating in Luther's early pastoral theology, culminating in Cohen. That's exactly what it's doing.
Now, I just wonder, just for because we can kind of start wrapping up, is there a way to kind of give maybe putting you on the spot for something that no pressure for, but is there a way to maybe summarize or to state the pastoral or the directly political message, I guess, that you're trying to show as a whole? Like, if the average person, not the specialist, not the theologian, what can they take from the Theologia Crucis through this constructive argument you're doing through Cohen, Barth, all of the other? Is there any particular thing you'd like to speak to for that?
Yes, one sentence. The pastoral and the political are connected and intertwined and should not be separated.
I like that. That's a very good point. Good. Well, yeah, no, I like that a lot. I think that's a good point. I'm very eager. Your dissertation will be published when it's finished, correct?
Yes, it has to be in order for me to gain the title of doctor.
No, that's great. Yeah, I'll be eager to read it. I'm sure everybody else will be eager to take a look. I've been privileged to read a few of the chapters, which I've been thankful for. But yeah, so after your dissertation, once they're finished, what then are your plans?
I am on the list for candidates for the vicariat in the Evangelische Landeskirche Baden. And so the vicariat is a 2-year pastoral, we would, American Lutherans would call it a 2-year pastoral internship. But it is the 2-year process by which afterwards one becomes ordained. So I will be ordained in the United Protestant Church of Baden. It is United Lutheran and Reformed, which is why when I said I wasn't really officially Lutheran anymore, that's what I meant. I'm in a hybrid. I've become a hybrid. And it's so funny because it's like I read my dissertation, what I've written of it, and I say, this so says United Theology. Like, wow. Most Germans don't think in those categories, but being an American, and not only being an American, but then being a convert to Lutheranism originally, confessions are important to me. Ecumenism is also very important to me, but confessions are too. So that's why I sort of picked up on that, that I was like, oh, I'm really mixing the Lutheran and the Reformed here. And I'm not using either one of those labels, right? It's not like I'm saying, well, Karl Barth and Moltmann are the Reformed voices. No, that's not what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So
Moltmann always struck me as being a good synthesis between the two. I always notice his appreciation and depth for Luther, but at the same time, he is very much reformed. So yeah, that's an interesting.
He was ordained. He was ordained on the Barmen Declaration.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I love about Baden is the Barmen Declaration forms one of our confessional documents.
Mm-hmm.
So I will be too.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Among other things, but I will be. In fact, Barmen is a major part of that. And for my own theology, I mean, I sort of shifted. Not that it has to be an either or, and it's not actually in Baden, but I shifted from the Augsburg Confession to the Barmen Declaration as the more I became convinced that I thought Karl Barth was right, the more the Barmen Declaration made sense to me. Whereas previously, when I was just a Lutheran, I would have had questions about the Barmen Declaration.
Very cool. Great. Well, I appreciate you coming with us. I have a final question, just something a little bit more fun.
Okay.
If you could have dinner with any theologian, either dead or alive, who would it be, and what would you ask them?
Do I only get one?
Yeah, let's say one for now.
Yeah, that's a really really hard one. If I could only have dinner with one theologian, and there are so many theologians that I love. My first thought obviously was Barth. My second thought was Luther. But if I bracketed them, because that's just so obvious. Oh, that is so hard.
We can make it two if you'd like.
No, that's being too nice to me. That's being too nice to me. Well, the first thing I have to think is, would it be recent or a long dead thinker? Schleiermacher. It is your book on Schleiermacher that convinced me how wonderful Schleiermacher is, how I was, again, doing the very thing that I've been trying to avoid doing for 15 years, which I was becoming too laser focused on Barth. And you showed me that, in some sense, the roots of dialectical theology aren't actually Luther and Calvin, but Schleiermacher. And so I pick him.
Okay, that's a good choice. I think it'd be a toss-up for myself with Barth, or I think it'd be probably Barth, but Barth or Schleiermacher would probably be up there for sure. No, that's quite an honor to know that I made such impact, but cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with the rest of your dissertation, with writing everything, and tell Professor Moltmann we all said hello, and all of us collectively on the YouTube world. But yeah, well, thanks so much for joining us, and yeah, good luck with everything.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and have a great day.
Thanks, you too. Bye.